My own son looked me in the eye and told me, "You'll die alone." He didn't whisper it. He didn't say it in private. He said it across a crowded family dinner table while everyone watched me in silence. My daughter-in-law let out a quiet laugh, as though those words were nothing more than an awkward joke. A few relatives smiled into their glasses instead of looking at me. My grandchildren lowered their eyes, pretending to study their plates because they couldn't bear to see what was happening. I felt every heartbeat inside my chest, yet somehow the room sounded strangely distant, like I was listening to someone else's life unfold. I stood up, folded my napkin beside my untouched dinner, and walked toward the front door without saying a single word. I didn't know it then, but 2 days later, every person sitting at that table would receive the same unexpected phone call, and not one of them would be able to meet my eyes again. Before I tell you how that happened, I'd like to ask one small favor. If this story truly resonates with you, let me know where you're watching from by sharing your city or country along with your local time. Sometimes it reminds me that even strangers can be closer than family. My name is Thomas Bennett. I'm 71 years old, and that Sunday evening forever changed the way I understood love, loyalty, and the people I once believed would stand beside me until the end. Ryan had invited everyone to his house in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was supposed to be an ordinary family dinner. Emily had spent all afternoon preparing roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and homemade rolls. The smell filled every room, reminding me of dinners my late wife, Eleanor, used to make before cancer quietly stole her from this world 6 years earlier. For a few minutes, I allowed myself to believe things were getting better. My grandson Ethan asked me about the old pickup truck we used to restore together. My granddaughter Mia smiled when I handed her the small box of chocolate-covered almonds I'd picked up on the way over because I remembered they were her favorite. Those tiny moments felt like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Then Ryan cleared his throat. He leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who believed he already knew every answer. "Dad," he said, swirling the ice in his glass, "have you ever thought about what happens when you get too old to take care of yourself?" I smiled politely. Every man thinks about that sooner or later. Emily exchanged a quick glance with him before looking down at her plate. One of Ryan's cousins chuckled under his breath. I noticed it, though I pretended not to. Ryan wasn't finished. "You know," he continued, "people only stick around when you still matter to them." The room became quieter. Forks stopped scraping against porcelain. Even the football game playing on the television in the next room suddenly seemed far away. I looked at my son, searching for the little boy who once waited by the front window every evening until I came home from work. Instead, I saw a man whose expression carried no hesitation at all. "You'll die alone," he said flatly. "Nobody needs a useless old man anymore." Emily covered her mouth, but it wasn't to hide shock. She was smiling. Someone near the end of the table laughed softly before quickly pretending to cough. Ethan stared at his mashed potatoes. Mia's fingers tightened around her napkin. Claire, my daughter, looked frozen, as though she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the courage. I waited for someone to tell Ryan he'd gone too far. No one did. The silence hurt more than the words themselves. Strange how betrayal rarely arrives like thunder. Sometimes it slips quietly into the room wearing familiar faces. I looked around that dining room at framed family photographs hanging on the walls. In nearly every picture, I was standing somewhere behind the camera, because I had been the one taking the photograph. I wondered if that had always been my place in their lives. Present, but unseen. Ryan finally shrugged. "I'm just being honest, Dad." Somebody had to say it. I nodded once. Not because I agreed with him, but because I suddenly understood something I had refused to see for years. I reached for my napkin, folded it carefully, and placed it beside my untouched plate. "Thank you for dinner," I said quietly. My voice surprised even me. It didn't shake. It didn't crack. It simply sounded tired. I picked up my old leather jacket from the back of the chair. No one offered to walk me to the door. No one apologized. As I stepped outside, the Oklahoma evening felt unusually cool. I sat inside my truck for several minutes without starting the engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel while the porch light behind me cast long shadows across the windshield. Through the front window, I could see everyone slowly returning to their conversation, as though nothing important had happened. They believed that was the end of the story. They believed an old man had simply accepted his place. What none of them knew was that earlier that very morning, before I ever drove to Ryan's house, I'd received an envelope that had been sitting unopened inside my mailbox. I hadn't told anyone about it. I hadn't even broken the seal. And as I finally turned the key in the ignition and drove into the darkness, that unopened envelope resting quietly on the passenger seat suddenly felt heavier than anything I had carried in my entire life. The drive home felt longer than it usually did, even though Ryan's neighborhood was only 20 minutes from my little house on the west side of Tulsa. The envelope stayed on the passenger seat beside me the entire way, untouched, while the headlights stretched across the empty road. Every red light gave me another excuse to remember things I had spent years convincing myself were too small to matter. The truth is, families rarely fall apart in one night. They wear down slowly, like an old porch step that creaks a little louder every winter, until one day it finally gives way beneath your feet. After Eleanor died, everyone promised they would never let me feel alone. Ryan hugged me at the funeral and said, "You are not losing a family, Dad. You are still our center." Claire squeezed my hand and whispered, "We will come every Sunday." Even little Ethan, only 10 years old back then, climbed into my lap and said, "Grandpa, I will help you fix the truck forever." I believed every word because I wanted to. During those first months, they visited often. Ryan mowed my lawn without being asked. Emily brought homemade soup. Claire called every evening just to make sure I had eaten dinner. The house still echoed with Eleanor's laughter, but at least it did not feel abandoned. Then life became busy. That was the explanation everyone gave me. Ryan received a promotion. Emily started volunteering with a local charity. Ethan joined the high school baseball team. Mia discovered dance classes. Claire accepted a nursing position at St. Francis Hospital. Every excuse sounded reasonable on its own. I repeated them to myself whenever another Sunday passed without hearing the front door open. One afternoon, I called Ryan just to ask if he wanted the old oak dining table that had belonged to his grandparents. "Maybe next month, Dad," he answered. "We have got a lot going on." Next month became 6 months. The table remained exactly where Eleanor had left it, with 4 matching chairs that no one ever sat in anymore. Every Thursday morning, I still polished the wood because she always had. Old habits survive even when the people who taught them are gone. The neighbors probably thought I was preparing for guests. I was really preserving memories. There was one Christmas that still visited me in quiet moments. I spent nearly 2 weeks rebuilding the wooden train set Ryan had loved as a little boy. The paint had faded, and one wheel was broken, but I repaired every piece by hand, because Ethan had once told me he wished he could play with the same train his father had owned. When everyone arrived, I carried the box into the living room with more excitement than I cared to admit. Ethan smiled the moment he saw it. "Grandpa, is that the real one?" he asked. Before I could answer, Emily looked at the train and sighed. "We really do not have room for old toys," she said. "The kids mostly use tablets now." Ryan laughed lightly. "Dad, you spend too much time holding on to the past." He said it casually, almost kindly, but I watched Ethan's smile disappear. Later that evening, after everyone left, I placed the train back on the shelf in my workshop. It has not moved since. Another memory found me as I pulled into my driveway that night, my 69th birthday. I had grilled hamburgers because Ryan always claimed nobody cooked them better than I did. I bought vanilla ice cream for Mia and cherry pie for Claire because she never liked cake. I even cleaned Eleanor's favorite blue dishes, although I rarely use them anymore. At 6 o'clock, I received a text. "Sorry, Dad. We cannot make it. Rain check?" There was nothing wrong with the weather. The sky stayed perfectly clear until sunset. I ate one hamburger alone and wrapped the others in aluminum foil. For nearly a week, I kept telling myself someone might still stop by. Nobody did. It would have been easy to become bitter after moments like those. Instead, I kept making excuses for them. Ryan is under pressure. Emily means well. The children are growing up. Those sentences became as familiar as my morning coffee. Looking back now, I wonder if I repeated them more for my own comfort than theirs. Love has a strange way of protecting the people who hurt us. It convinces us that neglect is temporary and silence is harmless. Yet every forgotten invitation, every canceled dinner, Every conversation cut short before I finished speaking quietly settled somewhere inside me. None of those moments seemed important enough to confront. Together, they became the story of how I slowly disappeared from my own family without anyone noticing. I stepped inside my house, hung my jacket beside Eleanor's old coat, and glanced once more at the unopened envelope waiting on the kitchen counter. The return address belonged to Collins and Harper Law Offices. Beneath the firm's name, someone had written 3 words by hand that made my pulse slow to a crawl. Personally, for Thomas. I stood in my kitchen for a long time before I finally picked up the envelope. The coffee I had poured after getting home had already gone cold, a thin gray film floating across the surface. Eleanor used to tease me for letting coffee grow old before I finished it. "Life is too short for cold coffee, Tommy," she would say with a smile. Funny how a simple memory could still make an empty room feel full. I slid my finger carefully beneath the seal and unfolded the letter inside. It was brief. "Mr. Bennett, please contact our office at your earliest convenience regarding documents previously entrusted to our care. Sincerely, David Collins." I read those 2 sentences 3 times. There was nothing dramatic about them. No explanation. No urgency written in bold letters. Yet something about the wording reminded me of a conversation that had taken place years earlier, one I had almost buried beneath everything else life had thrown at me. The next morning, I called the number. Collins and Harper Law Offices, a young receptionist answered. "Good morning. My name is Thomas Bennett. I received a letter from Mr. Collins." "One moment, Mr. Bennett." The line became quiet. A few seconds later, I heard a familiar voice. "Thomas." David Collins sounded older than I remembered, but just as steady. "I was hoping you would call. Your letter brought back more questions than answers," I admitted. He paused before replying. "Some conversations should happen in person. Can you come by tomorrow afternoon? Is something wrong?" Another brief silence. "Nothing is wrong. It is simply time." He ended the call without saying anything more. I sat there staring at the phone, wondering what exactly had become time. Later that afternoon, Ryan called unexpectedly. That alone felt unusual. "Dad," he said, sounding cheerful, "Emily and I were talking. We have been thinking maybe it is time to simplify things for you." I leaned back in my chair. "Simplify? Your house is too much work. The yard, the maintenance, all those old tools in the garage. I have managed them for 38 years. He laughed softly. "Exactly. 38 years is a long time. You deserve to relax." Before I could answer, Emily's voice floated through the speaker. "Tell him about the retirement community," Ryan continued. "There is a beautiful place just outside Broken Arrow. Golf course. Weekly activities. They even have transportation." I looked around my kitchen. Eleanor's recipe box still sat beside the refrigerator. Her wind chime moved gently outside the back window. Every corner of this house carried a piece of our life together. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but I am not moving." His voice changed almost immediately. "Dad, you are being stubborn. Or maybe I simply know where I belong." He sighed heavily. "You cannot keep making emotional decisions." I almost smiled at those words. Emotional decisions. I remembered working double shifts for years so Ryan could attend Oklahoma State University without drowning in student loans. I remembered taking out a second mortgage after the recession to keep my machine shop employees from losing their jobs. None of those choices had been called emotional then. They had been called responsible. "I will think about it," I said, mostly because I no longer wished to argue. "Please do," Ryan replied. "There are a lot of things that need to be settled sooner rather than later." The call ended, but one sentence stayed with me. Settled. It sounded less like concern and more like planning. That evening, Claire stopped by after finishing her shift at the hospital. She carried 2 containers of chicken noodle soup and immediately frowned when she saw my face. "You look tired, Dad." "Just thinking." She placed the soup in the refrigerator before sitting across from me. "Ryan called me." I nodded slowly. "He mentioned the retirement community." Claire hesitated. "Did he tell you he already toured it last week?" I looked up. "He what?" She seemed surprised by my reaction. "I assumed you knew. He asked me if I thought you would adjust well there." The room became strangely still. "He never mentioned that." Claire bit her lip. "Maybe he was waiting for the right moment." I wanted to believe that. I truly did. But something inside me had begun connecting pieces that had never seemed related before. The retirement home, the sudden concern about my property, the repeated conversations about simplifying my life. Even the cruel words at dinner felt different now, as though they had not been spoken in anger alone but had been leading somewhere. Claire reached across the table and rested her hand gently on mine. Dad, whatever is going on, promise me one thing. What is that? Do not let anyone pressure you into making decisions before you are ready. I squeezed her hand and nodded. After she left, I walked into the garage and switched on the old fluorescent light above my workbench. Dust floated through the air like tiny stars. In the far corner stood a gray metal filing cabinet that had not been opened in years. I stared at it for several seconds before pulling the bottom drawer open. Inside sat a thick blue folder with one name printed neatly across the front in David Collins's handwriting. Beneath it rested another sealed envelope I had completely forgotten existed, and taped across its flap were 6 handwritten words from Eleanor herself. Only if they force your hand. The next afternoon, I drove downtown with the blue folder resting on the passenger seat beside me, and Eleanor's sealed envelope tucked safely inside it. The Collins and Harper office occupied the 3rd floor of a brick building that had overlooked the same corner of Boston Avenue for longer than I could remember. I had only been there a handful of times over the years, yet stepping through the polished glass doors felt strangely familiar, like returning to a place where time had been waiting patiently for me. The receptionist greeted me with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bennett. Mr. Collins is expecting you." She led me down a quiet hallway, lined with framed photographs of Tulsa from decades past. When she opened the final office door, David Collins rose from behind his desk before I had taken 2 steps inside. His hair had turned almost completely silver since we last met, but his handshake was still firm. "Thomas," he said, holding my hand a moment longer than most people would. "It is good to see you again. I wish it were under lighter circumstances," I answered. He nodded with the understanding of a man who had spent an entire career watching families change when money, pride, or fear entered the room. Before either of us sat down, another gentleman walked into the office, carrying several folders beneath one arm. He paused the instant he saw me. His eyes narrowed as if he were searching through memories that had gathered dust. Then his face brightened. "Thomas Bennett?" he asked. I looked at him carefully before recognition finally arrived. "Judge Harold Whitmore." He laughed softly. "Retired now. Just Harold these days." We shook hands, and for the first time in days, I found myself smiling without forcing it. David looked between us with quiet amusement. "I had forgotten the two of you knew each other." Harold chuckled. "Knew each other? Thomas saved my family's livelihood 30 years ago." I frowned. "I only fixed a problem." "You did much more than that," Harold replied before taking a seat. "My brother's manufacturing company was weeks away from shutting its doors after a supplier walked away. Every bank told us no. Thomas took the contract anyway, worked nights with his crew, and refused to charge overtime until we recovered. Most people in this city never knew it happened because he never wanted credit." I shifted uncomfortably. "That was a long time ago." Harold looked directly at me. "Character does not expire with age." Those words settled heavily in the quiet room. David opened one of the folders and smiled faintly. "That is one of the reasons your wife trusted us with these documents." Hearing Eleanor mentioned made my chest tighten. David continued carefully. "She believed that one day people might forget who you really are. She wanted there to be a record that could not be rewritten by opinions or convenience." I stared at the blue folder resting on the desk. "She planned for that?" "More than you realized," David answered gently. "She loved your family deeply, but she also understood human nature." Harold leaned back in his chair. "Your wife was one of the wisest women I ever met." For several moments, nobody spoke. Outside the office window, traffic moved steadily through downtown Tulsa while sunlight reflected off nearby buildings. Life continued as though nothing extraordinary was happening inside that room. David finally broke the silence. "Thomas, before we discuss the documents themselves, I need to ask you one question." "Go ahead." "Has anyone recently encouraged you to sell your home, transfer assets, or make changes to your estate?" I thought of Ryan's cheerful voice suggesting retirement communities. I remembered Emily's comments about simplifying my life. I remembered Claire telling me Ryan had already toured a facility without ever speaking to me first. Yes, I answered quietly. David exchanged a brief glance with Harold. Neither man looked surprised. Then your timing could not have been better, David said. He unlocked a cabinet behind his desk and removed a thick binder secured with a dark leather strap. Unlike the blue folder, this binder carried several official seals across its cover. It looked less like paperwork and more like the history of an entire lifetime compressed into one place. David rested his hand on top of it but did not open it. Everything inside was prepared over many years, he said. Every signature was witnessed. Every decision was reviewed repeatedly. Nothing here was created in haste, and nothing here was written out of anger. I slowly nodded. What happens now? David's expression grew solemn. That depends entirely on what you decide. You still have complete control. He slid the binder a few inches closer to me before adding words I had never expected to hear. But once we begin, there will be no way for your family to pretend they never knew the truth. My fingers rested lightly on the leather cover. Just before I opened it, a single sheet slipped from between the pages and landed face up on the desk. Across the top, in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "To be presented only after the first betrayal becomes undeniable." My fingers rested on the edge of the binder, but I did not open it immediately. Instead, I looked at Eleanor's note again. She had always chosen her words carefully. She never believed in dramatic gestures. If she had written that the first betrayal had to become undeniable, it meant she had expected me to question my own instincts before accepting what was happening. David quietly folded the note and placed it beside the binder. Your wife insisted that this message remain separate, he said. She believed emotions should never cloud legal decisions. Harold smiled faintly. That sounds exactly like Eleanor. I let out a slow breath. She always thought 3 steps ahead of me. 5, Harold corrected with a gentle laugh. At least 5. For the first time since leaving Ryan's house, I felt the weight in my chest ease ever so slightly. Not because my problems had disappeared, but because I realized I was no longer carrying them alone. David unfastened the leather strap around the binder without revealing its contents. Instead, he reached for another folder that had been tucked beneath it. There is something you should see first, he said. Inside were copies of contracts, faded photographs, and handwritten notes spanning decades. None of them looked extraordinary by themselves. Together, they told the story of a life I had almost forgotten. One photograph showed a much younger version of me standing outside Bennett Precision Manufacturing with nearly 40 employees gathered behind me. I remembered every face. Some had worked beside me for 20 years. Others had only stayed a season before moving on. You kept all of this? I asked quietly. David nodded. Your wife did. Harold picked up the photograph and smiled. People still talk about this company. I shook my head. It was just a machine shop. Harold looked directly at me. No, Thomas. It became one of the most respected family-owned manufacturers in northeastern Oklahoma because you refused to cut corners. Another document caught my attention. It was a newspaper clipping from years ago. I barely remembered the interview. The headline read, "Local business owner refuses layoffs during economic downturn." Beneath it was a picture of me standing in front of the shop with grease on my hands instead of wearing a suit. Harold tapped the article gently. Most owners protected profits. You protected families. I looked away from the paper. We barely survived that year. But everyone else survived with you, Harold replied. David slid another document across the desk. This one listed scholarship donations to Tulsa Community College, stretching back almost 15 years. The amount surprised even me because I had never added everything together. Small contributions made consistently over time had quietly grown into something much larger than I realized. You never attached your name to any of these, David said. Every donation was anonymous. I smiled softly. The students needed tuition. They did not need my name. Harold folded his hands. That is exactly why people respected you. A strange feeling settled over me. At Ryan's dinner table, I had been made to feel like a man whose life no longer mattered. Yet here, inside this quiet office, pieces of my past were reminding me that value is not measured by who speaks the loudest during family dinners. It is measured by the lives quietly touched over many years. David continued turning pages. There were letters from former employees thanking me for helping them through illnesses, Christmas cards from families who had once depended on steady paychecks, even a handwritten note from a local pastor thanking Eleanor and me for anonymously repairing the church roof after a spring storm. I had forgotten about half of these moments. Eleanor never had. She had preserved them all. Why would she keep records like this? I finally asked. David answered carefully. Because legal documents establish ownership. Character establishes credibility. She believed one day both might become equally important. His words lingered in the room. Then he reached beneath a stack of papers and removed a slim envelope bearing the seal of a regional bank. Unlike everything else we had reviewed, this envelope had never been opened. My name appeared across the front in Eleanor's handwriting, but below it was another line written in David's. To remain sealed unless Thomas's intentions are questioned by immediate family. I stared at it without speaking. David met my eyes. Until Sunday evening, I never believed I would hand this to you. Harold slowly stood and walked toward the office window, giving me the privacy to make my decision. My thumb rested beneath the flap of the envelope. I hesitated, knowing that whatever waited inside had been protected for years for exactly this moment. As I finally broke the seal, a single folded document slipped onto the desk, and before I even unfolded it, David quietly whispered, "Everything changes after you read that page." The paper was heavier than it looked. Not because of the ink or the thick stationery, but because I could feel Eleanor's careful hand behind every sentence before I had even read the first line. I unfolded it slowly while David and Harold remained silent. Neither man seemed eager to interrupt what they already understood would become one of the most important moments of my life. The document was not a will, it was not a deed. It was a signed memorandum prepared nearly 8 years earlier, shortly after Eleanor received the diagnosis that changed everything. She had asked David to record a meeting between the three of us, documenting decisions we made together while her mind was still perfectly clear. At the bottom of the first page was her signature beside mine. The memory returned all at once. We had sat in this very office while she held my hand and smiled with remarkable calm. One day, she had said, "Love will be tested by comfort. That is when people discover who they really are." I had thought she was talking about grief. I realized now she had been talking about something much larger. David gently turned to another page. "Please continue," I read in silence. Eleanor had insisted that our family home remain under a living trust rather than transferring directly to Ryan or Claire after her death. The trust named me as the sole lifetime trustee with complete authority over every decision concerning the property, our remaining investments, and several accounts established for Ethan and Mia's education. Nothing could be sold, transferred, or redirected without my written approval. More importantly, the trust contained a personal statement that was not legally required but had been witnessed and preserved alongside the documents. Eleanor wrote that financial gifts should always strengthen family relationships, never replace them. If she ever believed those gifts were becoming expected instead of appreciated, she wanted me to protect both the assets and the values they represented. I lowered the pages and looked toward David. She thought this far ahead. He nodded. Every scenario was discussed. She never assumed the worst would happen. She simply believed preparation was another form of love. Harold folded his hands. She trusted your judgment more than anyone else's. I remained quiet for several moments. Suddenly, the conversations from the past few years sounded different inside my memory. Ryan asking whether I still needed such a large house. Emily suggesting that maintaining property at my age seemed irresponsible. Casual questions about insurance policies. Remarks about organizing paperwork before it became confusing. Individually, they had sounded harmless. Together, they formed a pattern I had never allowed myself to recognize. David watched my expression carefully. "You are beginning to see it." "I wish I were not," I admitted. Before either man could answer, my telephone vibrated across the polished wooden desk. Ryan's name appeared on the screen. I hesitated before answering. "Hello, Ryan." His voice sounded unusually friendly. "Dad, I have been thinking about our conversation yesterday. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot. Emily and I would like to stop by tonight." I glanced briefly toward David. "For what reason?" "Just to talk." There was a pause before he continued. "Actually, there are a few papers I think we should look over together. Nothing complicated, just practical things. My eyes drifted back to the trust documents lying open before me. What kind of papers? Another brief silence. You know, medical decisions, property planning, things like that. We should get ahead of them while everything is simple. His words were calm, but now I could hear something beneath them that I had missed before. Urgency, expectation, perhaps even confidence that I would simply agree. I already have those matters under control, I replied evenly. Ryan laughed awkwardly. Dad, you probably have old paperwork. We can help update everything. Thank you, I said, keeping my voice steady. But there is nothing that needs updating today. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt much longer. All right, he finally answered. We will talk another time. When the call ended, David quietly asked, Did he mention specific documents? I nodded. Property planning. Harold slowly exhaled through his nose. Interesting timing. No one rushed to conclusions. No one accused Ryan of anything. We simply allowed the facts to settle where they belonged. David carefully closed the folder containing Eleanor's memorandum. Thomas, I want to show you one final item before you decide how to proceed. He unlocked another drawer and removed a certified packet bearing the official seal of Tulsa County. Every page inside carried signatures, filing dates, and notarized acknowledgments stretching back years. He placed the packet in front of me but did not open it himself. These are public records, he said quietly. Anyone could have requested copies. Very few people ever did. I opened the packet and immediately recognized the first page. It was the original filing establishing the Bennett Family Living Trust. Attached to it was a schedule listing every property, every account, and every protected asset placed inside over the years. As my eyes reached the final page, I froze. Beneath my name as lifetime trustee appeared another entry that had never been mentioned by anyone in my family. Eleanor had named a successor trustee years before her death, and the person she chose was about to change everything. For several seconds, I simply stared at the final page. Then I looked up at David, certain I had misunderstood what I had just read. Claire? I asked quietly. David nodded once. Your wife named Claire as successor trustee if you were ever unable or unwilling to serve. Not Ryan. I leaned back in my chair, trying to reconcile the words before me with the assumptions my family had apparently been living under for years. Ryan had always behaved as though becoming the head of the family was inevitable. Yet Eleanor had quietly entrusted that responsibility to someone else. Harold folded his reading glasses and smiled gently. Your wife never made decisions based on birth order. She made them based on character. I looked back at the document. Claire's name had been written in Eleanor's own hand before the final draft was typed. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. David turned another page. There is one more provision. He pointed to a paragraph near the bottom. If family conflict arises because of financial expectations or pressure placed upon the trustee, an independent review may be initiated before any future distributions are approved. I let out a slow breath. She even planned for that. She hoped this section would never matter, David answered. But she believed protecting a family sometimes meant protecting it from itself. The office grew quiet again. Outside the window, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the sidewalks below, while people hurried home from work, unaware that an entire family's future was quietly shifting inside this room. David closed the binder carefully. Thomas, you have several options. You can leave everything exactly as it is. You can amend certain provisions, or, he paused before continuing. You may request a formal family meeting here, with everyone present, so every question is answered through the documents rather than assumptions. I looked. What would you do? He smiled thoughtfully. I spent 32 years listening to people argue over what they believed was fair. Documents settle legal questions. Character settles family questions. Right now, your family seems confused about both. Before I could answer, David's assistant knocked gently on the office door. I am sorry to interrupt, she said, but Mr. Walker just called. David exchanged a glance with me. Did he leave a message? Yes. She handed him a note before quietly stepping back into the hallway. David read it silently, then looked at me. He requested an appointment tomorrow morning. My eyebrows lifted slightly. Did he say why? He said he wants to discuss future estate planning on behalf of his father. Harold raised one eyebrow. On behalf of his father? David nodded. Those were his exact words. None of us spoke for a moment. The sentence itself revealed more than Ryan probably intended. He had already begun presenting himself as someone authorized to speak for me. Yet no such authority existed. I found myself feeling less angry than disappointed. It was becoming increasingly difficult to explain these moments away as misunderstandings. David folded the message and placed it beside the binder. I have not returned his call. Do not, I answered calmly. Not yet. He nodded. Very well. As our meeting ended, Harold walked with me toward the elevator. Before the doors opened, he rested a hand gently on my shoulder. Thomas, there is something you should know. I looked at him. Over the past few years, I have attended more community events than I can count. Your son speaks often about family responsibility. Does he? Harold nodded. He tells people he expects to take over your affairs someday, because that is simply what sons do. I felt no anger hearing those words, only sadness. Somewhere along the way, Ryan had mistaken inheritance for entitlement. They were never the same thing. I thanked Harold for his honesty and drove home through the familiar streets of Tulsa as the sun settled lower behind the trees. The house greeted me with its usual quiet. Eleanor's wind chime moved softly in the evening breeze. I fed the birds in the backyard, watered the flower bed she had planted years before, and tried to let the ordinary rhythm of home steady my thoughts. Around 7 o'clock, Claire called. Dad? She said gently. Are you all right? I am better than I was yesterday. She hesitated. Ryan called me. I waited. He sounded upset. He asked whether I knew anything about your paperwork. What did you tell him? The truth, she answered. I said your decisions belong to you. I smiled quietly. Thank you. There was another pause. Then her voice grew softer. Dad, there is something else. Go on, Emily called after Ryan. She thought I did not know she was on speaker. My grip tightened slightly around the phone. What did she say? Claire inhaled slowly before answering. She told Ryan, if your father changes those documents before we get involved, everything we planned falls apart. The room became perfectly still. I looked toward the kitchen table where Eleanor's old recipe box still rested beside the window. Until that moment, I had believed my son was making poor choices out of frustration, pride, or fear. But Claire's words suggested something entirely different. They suggested there had been a plan all along. Before I could respond, another call appeared on my screen. The caller identification read Collins and Harper Law Offices. I answered immediately. David did not waste a single word. Thomas, he said, his voice unusually serious, you need to come to my office first thing tomorrow morning. Someone else has requested copies of the trust records, and you are going to want to know exactly who it is. I arrived at David Collins's office just after 8 the following morning. The streets of downtown Tulsa were beginning to fill with commuters, but inside the law office, everything remained quiet. David was already waiting for me in the conference room, a fresh pot of coffee sitting untouched between us. Harold Whitmore stood beside the window with his hands folded behind his back, his calm expression telling me he already knew more than I did. David motioned for me to sit. The request came through yesterday afternoon, he said as he slid a folder across the polished table. Legally, the trust itself remains confidential. Certain filings are public record, but the full documents are not. I looked at him carefully. Who asked for them? David met my eyes without hesitation. An attorney representing Ryan and Emily. I felt my shoulders grow heavier, but I did not feel surprised anymore. That emotion had already passed. Did they receive anything? I asked. Only what the law permits, David answered. Nothing more. Harold slowly turned away from the window. People often assume confidence is the same as preparation. They are not. David opened the folder and placed several printed emails on the table. Their attorney contacted us, believing Ryan already had authority to participate in your estate planning. He paused before adding, when we requested documentation proving that authority, none existed. I quietly nodded. Because there never was any. Exactly. David folded his hands. Once that became clear, the conversation changed very quickly. There was no triumph in his voice, only facts. That was one reason I trusted him. He never exaggerated. He simply allowed the truth to stand on its own. Before we could continue, my telephone vibrated. "Claire," I answered immediately. "Good morning." Her voice sounded tired. "Dad, everything is coming apart." I remained silent, allowing her to continue. Ryan and Emily argued all night. She found out the attorney could not obtain the documents. She kept asking why he had acted as though everything was already settled. Claire hesitated before speaking again. She told him, "You promised your father would never question us." Those words lingered between us. They hurt, not because they revealed greed, but because they revealed certainty. They had believed I would never speak for myself. They had mistaken kindness for surrender. "How are the children?" I asked quietly. Claire sighed. Ethan heard them arguing. This morning he asked his mother if Grandpa had really done something wrong or if everyone had been unfair to him. I closed my eyes for a moment. Ethan had always listened more carefully than adults realized. "What did she tell him?" "Nothing," Claire answered. She could not answer him. After we ended the call, I looked toward David. Children usually recognize the truth long before adults admit it. Harold nodded slowly. Because children have not yet learned how to justify selfishness. Later that afternoon, David arranged the family meeting that Eleanor's documents had anticipated years earlier. No courtroom, no judge, just a conference room large enough for honest conversation and official records. Ryan arrived first. His confident stride from only days earlier had disappeared. Emily walked beside him carrying a leather notebook she never opened. Claire entered quietly and sat beside me without saying a word. Ethan and Mia remained at home with neighbors. David believed they should be spared what was about to happen. Once everyone had taken their seats, David spoke with the calm professionalism that had guided him through decades of family disputes. "This meeting exists for one purpose," he said, "to clarify legal facts and prevent future misunderstandings." He reviewed the trust exactly as it had been written years before. Every signature, every witness, every filing date, every provision, nobody interrupted, because there was nothing to dispute. The document spoke more clearly than any argument ever could. Ryan finally broke the silence. "Dad, why did you never tell us?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because your mother and I hoped these papers would never become necessary." Emily lowered her eyes. The confidence she had carried for years seemed to dissolve with every page David turned. "We thought," she began before stopping herself. David gently finished the sentence for her. "You thought assumptions carried the same weight as signed documents." Nobody corrected him because nobody could. Ryan rubbed his forehead with both hands. "I never wanted this to happen. For the first time, I believed he was telling the truth. Perhaps he had never intended to wound me as deeply as he had, but intentions could not erase choices." "Ryan," I said softly, "every important decision in life leaves something behind. Sometimes it leaves trust. Sometimes it leaves regret. We choose which one." Tears formed in Claire's eyes, though she quickly wiped them away. Emily quietly closed her notebook without writing a single word. The room remained still until David placed the final document back into its folder. "Mr. Bennett remains sole trustee," he said. "Nothing changes today except that everyone now understands the truth." There was no dramatic victory, no raised voices, no celebration, only the quiet realization that years of assumptions had collapsed under the weight of simple facts. As the meeting ended, Ryan stopped beside me before walking toward the door. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Dad, I do not know how to fix this." I looked at my son, not with anger, but with the sadness only a parent can carry. "Neither do I answered honestly. "But fixing something begins with admitting it was broken." He nodded once before leaving the room beside Emily. Claire remained seated until the hallway fell silent. She reached for my hand exactly as she had the day after Eleanor's funeral. "What happens now?" she asked. I looked through the conference room window where the afternoon sunlight stretched across the streets of Tulsa. For the first time in many years, I felt no need to prove anything to anyone. "Now," I said quietly, We find out whether a family can heal after the truth has finally been allowed to speak. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected, not because every wound had suddenly healed, but because the pretending had finally ended. There were no more whispered conversations about my future without me in the room. No more carefully disguised suggestions about what I should do with my home or my life. The truth had done something that anger never could. It had placed everyone face to face with the consequences of their own choices. David Collins completed the final review of the trust, exactly as Eleanor had intended years before. Nothing needed to be rewritten. Nothing needed to be rushed. My home remained my home. Ethan and Mia's education remained protected. Claire continued as the successor trustee, though she quietly told me one afternoon, "Dad, I hope I never have to use that responsibility." I smiled and squeezed her hand. So do I. Ryan stayed away for nearly 3 weeks. During that time, I spent my mornings much the same way I always had. I watered Eleanor's roses before the Oklahoma sun became too strong. I drank coffee on the back porch while listening to the wind chime she had picked out during a road trip through Arkansas many years earlier. I returned to the workshop where the old wooden train still rested on the shelf exactly where I had left it. For the first time in years, I carried it back to the workbench. I sanded one rough corner, touched up the faded paint, and polished the tiny brass bell on the engine until it reflected the light again. It felt less like repairing a toy and more like repairing a forgotten piece of myself. One Saturday afternoon, there was a knock at my front door. When I opened it, Ethan stood there alone, with his bicycle leaning against the porch railing. He looked taller than I remembered, though perhaps it was simply the way he carried himself now. "Hi, Grandpa," he said quietly. "Hi, buddy." He looked down at his hands for a moment before asking, "Can we work on the truck today?" I smiled without hesitation. "I was hoping you would ask." We spent the afternoon in the garage, changing the oil, checking the spark plugs, and talking about everything except lawyers and trust documents. At one point, Ethan looked at me and asked, "Grandpa, were you really going to die alone?" I set the wrench down and thought carefully before answering. "No, Ethan. I was afraid of something much worse." "What is worse than being alone?" he asked. I looked around the garage where photographs, old tools, and memories surrounded us. "Believing you have to earn love by giving away pieces of yourself." He nodded slowly, as though storing those words somewhere safe inside his heart. A few days later, Ryan called and asked if he could come by. This time he arrived alone. He stood on the porch much longer than necessary before I opened the door. The confidence that had once filled every conversation between us had disappeared. "Dad," he said softly, "I owe you more than an apology." I invited him inside without saying a word. We sat at the same kitchen table where Eleanor and I had shared thousands of ordinary mornings together. Ryan stared at the old coffee mug his mother had painted for me decades earlier. "I kept telling myself I was trying to protect the family," he admitted. "Somewhere along the way, I started believing your life belonged to me because I was your son." I listened quietly. He continued, "When you stopped arguing with me, I thought it meant you agreed. I never stopped to consider that maybe you were simply choosing peace over conflict." I nodded slowly. Silence is often mistaken for weakness by people who have never had to carry responsibility. Tears filled his eyes. "Can you forgive me?" I took a long breath before answering. "Forgiveness is a gift I give myself, Ryan. Trust is something we build together, one honest decision at a time." He lowered his head and quietly whispered, "I understand. It was not the end of our story. It was simply the first truthful page after many painful chapters." Emily wrote me a handwritten letter a week later. She did not excuse her behavior. She did not blame anyone else. She apologized for measuring my worth by what she believed I could provide, instead of appreciating the life I had already given to the family. I replied with a short note wishing her wisdom and peace. Some conversations do not need many words to be sincere. Months passed. Sunday dinners slowly returned, though they looked different now. Nobody assumed I would host every gathering. Nobody expected me to solve every problem. We laughed more, we listened more. Sometimes Ryan would stop in just to help trim the hedges without asking for anything in return. Sometimes Claire brought soup after her hospital shift simply because she knew I liked having company. Ethan finished restoring the old truck with me, and on the afternoon we finally drove it around the neighborhood. He smiled the same way his father once had when he was a little boy. Before winter arrived, I visited Eleanor's grave carrying fresh white roses from our garden. I sat on the small wooden bench beside her headstone until the afternoon sun began settling behind the trees. From my coat pocket, I removed the folded note she had written years before. I read it one last time before placing it beneath a small stone at the base of her monument. "You were right," I whispered. "Love needed protection, but so did dignity." As I stood to leave, I slipped the old brass key to our workshop back into my pocket. It was never the key to our wealth. It had always been the key to the place where our family learned patience, honesty, and hard work. I finally understood that those had been our greatest inheritance all along. If you have ever found yourself feeling invisible inside your own family, I hope you remember this. Your kindness should never require you to surrender your self-respect. Healthy boundaries are not acts of rejection. They are acts of wisdom. Independence is not loneliness. It is the freedom to live with dignity while leaving the door open for sincere love to return. Never measure your worth by how loudly others recognize it. Measure it by the quiet integrity you carry when nobody is watching. If this story touched your heart, I would be grateful if you would like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who may need this reminder today. The simplest lesson I learned is this: love grows strongest where respect is allowed to live beside it. Thank you for spending this journey with me. Until our paths cross again in another story, may your heart remain steady, your home filled with peace, and your life guided by the quiet strength that no one can ever take away.